This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, we will unfortunately be going just all audio, having some issues with my either Skype or my recording device. But I am joined by two guests in regard to the life and career of filmmaker John Cassavetes. Edwin Adrian Nieves is a young filmmaker that I found online. Alex Sheramet is a critic who had a book called Woody Allen Reel to Reel that he talked about in the first Dan Schneider video interview. We were going to be joined by a film critic and biographer of John Cassavetes named Marshall Fine, but he had to decline at the last moment. So for the next hour or so, Edwin, Alex, and I will be talking about the life and career of John Cassavetes, and we will return in just a moment.
My father came over to America when he was 11 years old. He was born in Piraeus, Greece, and he heard about this country when a missionary came through town one day saying there was brotherhood in America. That if you wanted to work and learn, the American people would open their arms and hearts to you. My parents allowed their two sons to be individuals. My family was a wild and wonderful place with lots of friends and neighbors visiting and talking loud and eating loud, and nobody telling their children to be quiet or putting them down. When we had money, we went to the movies. When we didn't, we sat around the kitchen table and told stories. I was a totally uninterested student in high school. I didn't want to go to college because college in the 50s was just a way of getting a diploma. I hitchhiked down to Florida for a few weeks, and when I got back home, I bumped into some friends of mine, funny guys. Hey, John, we just signed up at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts to become actors, man. Come with us. The school's packed with girls. I'd get up on stage and shout. A couple of the teachers liked that because it showed a lot of enthusiasm. For a long time, that's all I thought acting was about, to show a lot of emotion. I attended the academy for a year and then spent 2 years making the rounds. There's something about the motivation of fear that makes you work terribly hard. But as an actor, you don't get the freedom to function the way you'd like to. I know I never got the lines I wanted under other directors. I wanted to direct, to find out everything I'm capable of, and to make the most of it, whether people like it or not. I believe that when you're young, you should go to all the places you're uncomfortable in and prove yourself. Because someday you're going to have to prove yourself. When things are original, obviously they're a little more difficult. That's why the viewers usually come out angry. When they're angry, I don't get angry. I kind of like it. It's never easy. I think that it's only in the movies that it's easy. I don't think that people want their lives to be easy. I think it's a United States sickness. In the end, it becomes more difficult. I like things to be difficult so that my life will be easier.
To be able to have that pressure and have that control and having integrity in his movies.
It's ridiculous.
Is not easy to do. John was a really great technical filmmaker, and I don't think people give him credit for that. I think they think he's just this kind of maverick, wild man who shot whatever happened. I don't think you can do that and end up with movies like he made. He was really talented, very skilled, and had spent years and years learning how to write and edit and shoot. I mean, it wasn't like you can't just turn a camera on and let people go crazy. I mean, it doesn't work.
This is Dan Schneider, and we're going to talk about the life of John Cassavetes. I am joined by Alex Sheramet, a film critic, and Edwin Nieves, a filmmaker. Let me just give both of you a chance to just give a minute or two introduction to the listeners as to who you are and what attracts you about John Cassavetes. So, Edwin, I found you, I think it was through Tumblr and through Vimeo, and you had an essay, and you also did a little 9 or 10 minute film about Cassavetes. So if you could tell the listeners who you are and what drew you to Cassavetes, please.
Hi, my name is Edwin Nieves. I'm a filmmaker from New York. I run A Bittersweet Life, a creative engine with a focus on filmmaking and a goal to inspire filmmakers and artists. And one of those points of departure for inspiration for me has been John Cassavetes. As a filmmaker, I do believe he's definitely one of the most important filmmakers for emerging filmmakers today, especially through his independent spirit. What drew me to him was the fact that he's all about do it yourself. Find a way to make the film, no matter what. You don't have a big budget, there's always a way. It's always a filmmaker, in essence, through him, becomes a creative problem solver. That's one thing that I feel has been a great resource for filmmakers, and especially today with the digital revolution and people who want to express themselves in a cinematic art form. I definitely believe that John Cassavetes is one to study for everyone.
I know in one of your posts you had listed Martin Scorsese's like 4 or 5 bullet points about filmmaking. We'll talk about that a little bit later and how that applies to Cassavetes. Alex, if you want to just give a brief recap of who you are and what draws you to Cassavetes.
My name is Alex Sherman. I'm a poet, critic, and novelist from New York City. And one of the things that I first realized about John Cassavetes, I first started watching his films maybe about 5 years ago. Beyond what you see visually, it is very much a new way of making films. It has not really been replicated. I don't think too many filmmakers have followed him in that regard. But on the other side, when it comes to his scripting decisions, they are simply very, very different from typical literary art, from typical literary writing, and yet they work on levels that great art still works on nonetheless. And this sort of thing it's unexpected. It sort of gives you this as far as creating art in a new way, and it's definitely impacted my own writing and novels in the future, and things that I could use and things that other artists could use from John Cassavetes in ways that are not really expected, in ways that Cassavetes himself probably wouldn't be able to ever have predicted. So these are really the key points that I take away from his films, and what has, beyond initially watching him, has made me pretty much stay and want to keep engaging with the art.
Now, I had mentioned that there was going to be a third participant in this show. His name was Marshall Fine, and he had written a biography of John Cassavetes. So I was hoping that he would sort of be the point man on some of the personal life realities of Cassavetes' life. So in his absence, I just wanted to let some of the viewers know a little bit about Cassavetes, because one of the things that I think a lot of people, when they watch these kinds of or listen to these kinds of podcasts or videos, they assume that a lot of things are going to be known by a lot of people. So just so people know, John Cassavetes was born on December 9th, 1929 and died on February 3rd, 1989. And he died at the age of 59. He was married to an actress named Jenna Rollins. He was born in New York City. He was of Greek background ancestry. In the 1950s, he had started out in a method acting workshop, and I'm reading some of the information from the Wikipedia page. Sometimes that can be dubious, but I know most of this is so. He had done some television work in the 1950s on live television. He became an actor in other people's films throughout the 1960s to pay for his own films that he directed. Probably most famously known for his role in Rosemary's Baby. And we'll talk a little bit about his straight acting job and his career as an actor in a little bit as well. But that's just sort of the sort of nutshell of Cassavetes before he started directing his own films. And his first film was in 1959, and it was a film called Shadows. So let's just maybe just start and talk about Shadows. I had not seen the whole full film until a few years back when the Criterion Collection, which is sort of the most prestigious of the American DVD companies in terms of releasing art house films, released a 5-pack of Cassavetes films called Five Films. And in it in 1959, it explored an interracial relationship. I don't think it's a particularly it's not a great film, but it's an interesting film. It's a good starting point. So maybe, Edwin, can you talk a little bit about the first film of Cassavetes, Shadows? What is your opinion of it? When did you first see it? And as a first film from a young filmmaker, do you take anything from it?
Well, I first saw Shadow a while ago. I think several years ago. It's been a while now. But I just remember the rawness of the screen just impacting me. It just felt like raw power was coming out of the camera. From the history that I know about the film, low budget, he kind of went in guerrilla filmmaking style, and that definitely inspired me with my own first films as well. Definitely, since it was his early start, his camera work, his mise en scène, I would say, isn't really fine. I don't think he ever reached a point where it was fine, like elegant or whatnot. I don't think he ever even cared about that, to be honest. I've read a quote where to him technique is nothing to really worry about. His focus was the actors and the human emotions that the actors can express, and how the camera can just capture that in its purity. So the impact that film had on me was just, this is a guy who has something to say, wants to say it, and is figuring out any way possible to say it. So that to me alone, first of all, creating a film on its own is a miracle. So that's a success. But the fact that he brought all those ideas together, that to me makes that film very important in his whole filmography as well.
How about you, Alex? What are your thoughts on Shadows in 1959, his first film?
Well, there's, as some listeners might know, there's actually two versions of Shadows, as far as, not for public consumption, but as far as how they impacted Cassavetes in the long run. He was making it, I believe, in first 56 or 57 in his late 20s. And that one was kind of, from everything I've read, fairly haphazard. It's more so Cassavetes, when he had his whole youthful exuberance, he wanted to get at the so-called truth of human interactions, little pieces of human behavior on screen. And it didn't seem to, from what I've read, it doesn't really seem to have the same sort of narrative that the later film has. The later film seems to be a lot more polished. It seems to be more linear in some respects. It seems to have a stronger narrative overall. And watching it today, it does very much play as an early film. It's interesting because when you read the contemporary critics now that are, looking back 50 years ago, there's a lot of praise. There's a lot of almost kind of heavy-handed respect that Cassavetes has shown, partly because Cassavetes himself just very much loves the film, and he considered it one of his chief accomplishments, especially at the time. But it does very much play like a young filmmaker's first film. It doesn't have the kinds of situations later films have. It doesn't have the same strength of the screenplays. There are some lines that stick out. There are some interactions between actors that are very much in tune with what happens in later films. But for the most part, it has just a number of great moments, and just kind of a plateau very often of mediocrity. It's not something I consider not even the top 3 or 4 films that he's made. For that reason.
Now, you mentioned that there's 2 versions of the film. Now, a little bit late, I wanted to talk. I know there was the Ray Carney sort of feud with Jenna Rollins about one of Cassavetes' films. Was that about the early version of Shadows?
Yeah, early version might be a bit of a misnomer. It's basically Cassavetes' first film experiment. Again, I forget when it was first released. It was either 56 or 57. It was screened for a non-paying audience. A lot of critics that looked at it, they did think it was a great work of art. In fact, there was this one argument that Cassavetes had with one film critic, because he screened for him the first version of Shadows, and a couple years later he completely re-edited it and made it, I guess, a bit more conventional. And the critic grew upset because now all his words of praise that were out in the open, he thought that people were now watching the new version of Shadows and taking it as he was praising the new version, when in fact that wasn't the case. So Cassavetes re-edited it because he felt it was just too much of an amateur job, and in fact, it probably was. Shadows, as it is now, feels a bit amateurish, a bit kind of a little bit all over the place, kind of a very loose narrative. That was probably more so the case with the 56, 57 version. It's not out for public consumption. Cassavetes, from most of his statements, has said that the latter work is superior. Watching it would probably be looking at a sketch or notebook of an artist, or looking at an artist's notes for a novel. There are people that might want to see that, but Cassavetes had the right to not show it. He re-edited the film. He did what he thought was a better job. This is the final version. This is what's meant to be seen. Anything other than that is exactly that. It's kind of a prototype, and that's really where the conflict emerges between Carney and Jenna Rowlands about his desire to screen it, which happened actually without her even being informed that he had a copy of this print, which she probably had not seen for 50 years at that point.
Yeah. Because I'm just looking on Wikipedia, and so it says that Carney has the 57 version, and I guess is Jenna Rowlands suing Carney to get back that version?
Well, it's interesting because he found the print, I believe sometime in the early 2000s after close to a 2-decade search. And at the beginning, it wasn't exactly clear as far as who has the rights to what. This was not released publicly after the re-edited version of Shadows came to light in '59. So he found this print. He did not contact Jenna Rowlands. He did not contact Al Rubin. Perhaps he feared that they would say no, but he didn't contact anybody, and he decided to advertise a screening of this first version of Shadows at the Rotterdam Film Festival. And eventually word got back to Jenna Rowlands. She became very upset that she didn't know anything about this, nor was she asked for permission. So the Rotterdam Film Festival was forced to change its advertising, was forced to tell all the people that purchased the tickets that they would not be able to see the first version. At this point, Ray Carney claims that after talking to multiple intellectual kind of copyright lawyers, that it is within his right to do whatever he pleases with this print because it's not under copyright protection. I don't know how true this is. I'm sure Al Rubin and Rowlands think differently, but at least according from his perspective, he has the rights to it, but he has not proceeded any further, probably because of a fear of reprisal.
Okay. Well, we'll maybe get back a little bit on that later. I want to take a break here, and in between these two segments, I'm going to play a little bit about a 6 or 7 minute segment from Faces, which was the next film in Cassavetes' directing canon. So we'll let the listeners actually view this, and when we get back, we'll discuss Faces. We'll discuss that particular scene with Edwin Nieves and Alex Shermet.
Wait a minute! What the hell are we talking about? Who cares? Yeah, so for a minute or two, we're not stupid, we're having a good time. Who does it hurt? I mean, who makes up the rules anyway? I mean, always play it cool, always put everybody down. Standing around in the corner looking out the side of your eye, see if anybody's looking at you. Listen, hell, fellas, I'm 28. I'm 23 years old. It's time for me to forget myself, right? Right. Down the middle class. Right. Down with the white collar. Down with the... Straight in the behind. That was jerk. Vicky, he just got sick.
No, not one of these guys who has a
No, I know.
That's it.
He's a
Oh, there it is. Come on out. The help the family
That's right.
responsibilities. And come on out. Let's ball it up, old buddy. What's the matter? We don't even know each other. I'm talking about somebody deep down.
This is Dan Schneider, and we are going to talk about Faces and some of the rest of the films in John Cassavetes' directing canon. Again, I apologize for technical difficulties. This video interview is basically audio, but we do have video of some of Cassavetes' work. I will be peppering in a few things from John Cassavetes' documentary, A Constant Forge, but you will have just seen about a 2-minute clip from the 1968 film Faces, which was, in my opinion, John Cassavetes' first truly great film. So, Alex, since you and Edwin have also seen that clip, why don't you just give a little brief description of that clip, where it comes in the film, and I believe it's great. I don't know if you do. Give your opinion on it, and then we'll hear Edwin's take. I'm sorry. Alex.
So this is a part of the film where Jen Rollins' character, who is I guess a kind of prostitute. This is after she meets John Marley's character, and they're all hanging out. You see the three of them bonding with each other. As the scene progresses, not so much here, but in the film itself, you start noticing this subtle conflict emerging between the two males. They start kind of vying for the attention of Jenna Rollins. One gets upset because John Marley's character is getting all the attention from Jenna Rollins. She's clearly interested in him. He's clearly interested in her, perhaps for reasons that go even beyond the fact that she's a call girl. She seems to show this genuine affection for him, and the other man, he feels rejected. It comes along almost gently, in a sense. It's something that develops slowly and over time. You start noticing little ticks in their movements. You start noticing little glances that they give each other that show that there's this competition emerging. And it's just very, in a sense, just very hyper-realistic. This is exactly what happens between men in similar situations in parties and elsewhere. This is exactly what you would expect. And as far as John Cassavetes saying that that he wishes to capture this truthfulness of human behavior, I feel like this film especially does this, and it does it in a very interesting way. So many of the characters are just perpetually drunk, both as actors and also in real life much of the time. And it's interesting to watch for that reason. You look at it and it seems so loose and so all over the place. There's a very, very strong narrative underneath. And it emerges both in this scene and just throughout the film in general. You see this constantly. You see it all the time.
Right, and it's actually 2 minutes out of about a 17-minute scene, and this is one of the first scenes that I know some critics, started the whole kind of meme that Cassavetes is too loose. It's improvisational and whatnot, and so maybe. If Edwin wants to comment on this too, what is your opinion on this? Because I think where it comes in the film quite early, it really sets up that we are looking at real people. They're acting really raw, and it's not anything like was ever done in Hollywood film before. So, Edwin, maybe if you want to comment on that.
Right here with this scene, really you have to give it up to the actors. That is just awesome acting. As far as the improvisation, from what I understand from John Cassavetes, is that he writes a really tight script. The actors learn the script, and then on set they're allowed to go with it. So that's the kind of improvisation he does. It's not just loose; it's disciplined. And I think with this one, you can definitely feel that he gives his actors space to express themselves, to explore their characters. And when a director does do that, it gives the actor a lot of potential to really give a performance that is centered on truthfulness. One part I love about the scene is when Jenna she admits, she confesses her age out of nowhere by accident, and then tries to correct herself. She's like, "Oh, I'm 28," and then smiles like 23, 23.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen that before. It's so great, but I think when critics say that a lot of this is improvised, I feel like some of it has to do with the camera blocking. Sometimes the actors disappear from the edge of the frame. Sometimes the cameraman, makes up for missing a part of the actor, so moves the camera around. And in essence, I think this is what tricks some people, saying, "Oh, this is very improvised. This is very just shooting. Let's just shoot. It's not blocked." But as far as the performances, like, to get something like that, you really have to work hard at it. It's not, all right, let's go on set, let's just do this. No, they know their lines. They know what they want. They know the characters. They know where the characters relate to them as well. And I think that's probably one of the greatest attributes to Cassavetes, is that he is an actor's director, and you can see that in this.
Yeah, you talk about the blocking. I know if you look at the films of someone Stanley Kubrick or an Akira Kurosawa, everything is like perfectly detailed. Whereas in this one, like you said, people will sometimes you'll only get half their face, or they'll be off to the sides, or they'll be talking, and the camera will stay with one character. Yet the thing that's actually the most important being said is off stage, and I know a lot of times I've known actors, and they improvisation is often thought of by people who don't know that you just make the stuff up right there. Whereas improvisation really is one of those things where you'll have a script, people will go 20 or 30 minutes, and they'll say, well, if I did this and I went, this little bit that way from the script, what would you do? And so it's not really being made up on the spot. It's something that's played with, and it's I think in one of the 5 Scorsese points that you have on one of your pages, Ed, when you talk about it being just the blueprint, the script, the screenplay is the blueprint, and I think this was like the first film that really did that. Shadows had a little bit of that, but it had nothing, and it extended 15, 16, 17 minutes, whatever that scene actually runs, like that. And this is just sort of like, it's almost like an H-bomb or a nuclear bomb dropped into what had been the Hollywood style, and it just totally, that scene in this film, but that scene was just something that in a way was very revolutionary. So, Alex, do you agree with that this was almost a seminal point in filmmaking, American filmmaking, that scene?
Before I get to that, I just wanted to add to this idea of it being an improvisation. Part of it came from when Cassavetes made Shadows. He had that sign card at the end of the film saying that this was improvisation. What he meant by that was not that the script was improvised. It was not that the actors were acting haphazardly. What he meant by improvisation was that the acting itself, in some ways, was improvised. So, although everybody in his films always had a script to follow, he didn't really encourage deviations from the script. Sometimes, if a line worked better and, he would hear a suggestion, he would make that change. But in general, the script was sort of set in stone, and this is what people did. However, people, as they played the script, as they tried to figure out what they wanted to do, it was really up to them to figure out how they would deliver the lines, whether or not they would get up and walk across the room. These things were the aspects that Cassavetes himself did not always control. Often he did, oftentimes he did not. This is where the improvised aspects started coming in. So a lot of what you see Jenna Rollins doing, a lot of what you see John Marley doing, he was not, Cassavetes himself probably did not tell the actors to do this or do that. A lot of that came actually from them. So this is what the idea of improvisation meant. And throughout his life, he always hated this idea of that his films were loose and that everything was, haphazardly improvised. He always railed against that idea for a very good reason. And again, partly for that reason, to go back to your question about it being a seminal film, you did not see things like this occurring on screen. You did not see not only the kind of acting method you see within Cassavetes films, you also did not see the sort of kind of anti-Hollywood tropes. So, for example, you mentioned how you could have important conversations happening pretty much off screen. This happens in Faces a lot. Somebody speaking, they are ostensibly the key character in that scene or whatever else is going on. Yet, for whatever reason, the camera occludes them. They're hidden by, somebody waving their hands. They're hidden by some other object. Something else is going on. And the viewer's forced to think about this, and he starts to think, well, is this an occlusion that's simply, a sort of technical addition to make it, look interesting or new or fresh? Or does it actually have meaning? Is Cassavetes, as the overvoice in the film, is he the one that's casting doubt on what this character is saying? Is he saying this character's words are unimportant? Is he saying that this is somehow false? This is somehow not true? And you're forced to evaluate these things as the film goes on. This happens especially in Chinese Bookie, in that famous pep talk that Cosmo Vitelli gives to his girls. He's the most important speaker in that scene, and yet he's in the back. He's constantly being interrupted by the girl's hands. You often don't see his face, and you wonder how much of this is Cassavetes casting doubt on Cosmo Vitelli as a human being and as a speaker, and how much of it is a means of perhaps even bringing attention to him in a way that is very much anti-Hollywood, and you're forced to make those judgments.
Well, let's skip towards the end of this film, because this is a key scene very early in the film that runs maybe 15 to 20 minutes. But the ending of the film this is basically a film about unhappy people, the dissolution of a marriage, and the end of the film too was something that really Hollywood hadn't seen. And it should be noted, this is a black and white film in 1968. By 1968, almost all films made in Hollywood had gone to color for the last 3 or 4 years. But the ending of the film, let me go back to Edwin to talk about this too, and then Alex can jump in. The end of the film, there's no Hollywood ending, and it's not only not a happy ending in a Hollywood ending. The film just sort of ends. I mean, the last scene, I believe, is the two main characters in the couple they have an argument. The man, John, what's his name? I forget the character's name, but he's sitting on the stairs. The wife comes down the stairs. She's sort of like, "Can I get by?" He lets her go by, and then the two people just walk out of the camera. And so there isn't even like a dramatic end. It's just like, going out with a whimper. I think that was another thing that had never been done in Hollywood films before. And not that this was a Hollywood film, I should say American film. This was something that characters, they go on, and we have no idea what's going to happen. They'll probably end up divorced or something, but the film just ends. So Edwin, if you could just maybe talk about the ending and how powerful or how important that is.
It's very important, especially when you consider the art of John Cassavetes. Well, essentially, the ending is, that's life. Life marches on, time marches on. This isn't a Hollywood film. This is a film that's trying to depict the reality of life, human drama, and what it is to be in a relationship. In Hollywood, there's a concept of, the couple. Yes, they struggle, but then they always meet, hope wins, and they're in love forever. But in reality, human relationships are really tough. That's the reality of it. It's a lot of work, and, you have to work together with it. Now with Faces, obviously the ending kind of, I feel, is what adheres to John Cassavetes' idea of cinema, of a cinema of truthfulness. This is what happens in life. You have an argument with your wife or husband, and then, what do you do after there? Sometimes you just walk out of the room. It's separate ways. Sometimes you talk. but it's never the Hollywood makeup story. So I think this is, again, Cassavetes sticking to his guns on he wants to depict the human condition, human relationships, and the reality that we all face. And he's being faithful to that.
Alex, your comments?
I'll agree with both of your comments on this so far. It's interesting to note, however, that Cassavetes, when it came to pretty much all of his films, he felt that they were all very hopeful, very positive, and very uplifting. He even thought this of Faces, and surprisingly, he thought this of A Woman Under the Influence. And he would point to this scene specifically as, the two, they have this argument. They clearly have a very kind of broken marriage. But to Cassavetes, he sees the two of them interacting in the scene. He sees that now it's time to sort of clean up after themselves, and they've come to some sort of new understanding. When John Marley catches Seymour Cassel with his wife, he realizes that, this is a critical point. Something has been breached, and I need to either make amends or this marriage is going to dissolve. In Cassavetes' mind, the marriage does not dissolve. It goes on, and they reach some kind of new understanding, possibly. However, I think the vast majority of people watching this then as well as now, they have to take into consideration the fact that human beings, they are very much limited by patterns and by habits. And, you see these two people, they are very immature. They have no idea how to communicate with each other. They have no idea how to even communicate with themselves. And you have to take into account what is going to happen between these two people. Are they really going to kind of turn a new leaf? Are they really going to learn from all these mistakes? Most likely they're going to be stuck in these habits. They're going to be stuck in these patterns for a very long time. And I think this is the impression that most viewers will get then as now, contrary to what Cassavetes himself might have felt about the film.
Yeah. Before we go on to the next couple of films, I don't know if Edwin had seen any of the films of Michelangelo Antonioni, but there's a film that Antonioni had done in the early 60s called La Notte, The Night, which basically also tracks the dissolution of a marriage. And I believe Faces takes place over about a 24-hour period. I could be wrong, but it's interesting because in Antonioni's film, all of the shots are blocked. Everything is geometrical and whatnot. It's tight, whereas there's a looseness to Cassavetes. In the end, the couple goes off to a party in the Antonioni film, and they end up basically leaving the party in the morning, and there is a hint that they might get back together. And I think that's a great film. This film is great in almost a polar way. I don't know, Edwin, if you've seen that film. To me, these films, one at the beginning of the 60s, one towards the end of the 60s, seem, even with two different directors on two different continents, seem to me to be almost like point and counterpoint about marriage during the sexual revolution of the 60s. Do either of you have any comments on that, do you think?
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily call them polar. I think stylistically they are very much polar. I think as far as the methods that they use to achieve their effects and to achieve, I guess, the kind of endpoint that they do might be polar in some ways. But I think more than anything, films show how you could have such differing methods yet still reach greatness in art. I think just like as with Faces, La Notte has this kind of depressing aura of, nothing really is going to get better. Perhaps something might happen in Faces, perhaps something might happen. But for the most part, there's this heaviness, and the tone in some ways might be similar, but the technique is what's polar. I wouldn't say that the take on marriage is too different. I think the basic issues that both couples have in Faces as well as Antonioni's film, it comes down to an inability to communicate, an ability to understand themselves and to understand why they do the things that they do. They're not able to come to terms with that. So the intellectual grounds I feel are very similar, and the end point in some ways is pretty similar as well.
Edwin, have you seen La Notte? Do you have any comments?
Oh yes, I actually do agree fully with Alex. I think the ending to both of these, and I like the fact that he brought up how Cassavetes feels like there's always hope at the end of his films. I think that comes from his very maybe optimistic perspective on life, or how he himself carries himself. I know that he and Jenna Rollins, they had a great relationship, but they also fought a lot, for example. They also struggled a lot. And that probably interested him in how to express those facts of human relationships into film, where, Hollywood and other studios weren't very interested in expressing, the reality of adulthood, adult life. Being an adult is very complicated, and I think both films do a good job in showing the complexity behind being an adult and trying to carry on a relationship, and especially an intimate one, with another adult. But they also show that it's really it's up to choice. It's not fate. Nothing else is forcing you into a certain destination. It's how two individuals work at it at the end. And perhaps, that in itself means there's hope for human relationships.
Well, let's...
go ahead. One of the interesting things about Faces for me is, when I was a kid and I first got into film, I was just in a series of not very good relationships, and I wanted to find answers for myself and for why people do the things that they do in film. And most movies are not able to supply that at all, but Woody Allen's films were able to do that, and definitely Cassavetes' films, specifically Faces. I would see how the characters interact. I would sort of watch how the jealousy between the male characters slowly kind of bubbles up and develops, and I would try to see where else have I seen this in my life, where else have I seen this in the life of others. And I would agree with Edwin. This is a very adult take on adult themes. I feel like when you're a kid, you sort of see people around you, and you're thinking, they're only acting this way because they're still kids like me, but eventually we're all going to grow up and we're going to mature and we're going to put this behind us. But then you meet these same people 10, 20 years later and they still behave in identical ways. And if you've kind of grown beyond that, you want to see this growth represented somewhere. You want to see it depicted. You want to be able to engage with it. And Cassavetes' films are able to, they allowed me to do that. I wanted to engage in how not so much mature human beings, because I wouldn't call the people in Faces mature, but what would a mature overvoice be that depicts as human beings? And Cassavetes, he clearly, even if he says he doesn't, he does have judgments on some of these characters. He does pass judgments. He does say many things about them. And, there was a market for this, and people of maturity, they want to see this depicted. They felt that they've gotten beyond this in their own lives. They want to see it depicted in this kind of parallel life, which to me, art is very much a parallel life. It runs parallel to everything we experience, and it idealizes all that and puts it in this case on screen.
Now let's talk and end this segment with the three films that came after, because I want to do a whole segment on the two of his other great films, Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Opening Night, in the late 70s. But in the early 70s, after Faces, he did three consecutive films, Husbands, Minnie and Moskowitz, and A Woman Under the Influence. And I think all of them have some interesting parts. All of them have some negative qualities. All of them, well, two of them, I'd say Husbands and Woman, have some great parts to them. So I would say these are films that have potential and sometimes miss along the way. So I want to ask both of you, do you agree with those assessments? And let's just go like film by film, and let's start off with Husband. So maybe Edwin, first off, do you agree that those three films have some some greatness in them, but also some flaws? Or do you think that any of those three films are equal to Faces, or what?
I mean, I would say probably in my top three would be A Woman Under the Influence. So definitely at least one of those three films is one of his greats, at least to me.
Yeah, and that is probably his most famous film, because that I think was the most honored at the Oscars. So why don't we start there? That's the third of those films. That was made in 1974, and that's probably Jenna Rollins' also most famous acting performance, at least in the Cassavetes canon. So why don't you expound upon what you think are the pros, and if there's any cons that you see in A Woman Under the Influence, Edwin?
All right. I would say, I mean, taking away the pros and cons, something that Alex did hint at was when children grow up, you expect that people become adults and, you're ready for life, you're a grown-up. That's how you are. I feel like A Woman Under the Influence shows you that at the core, you always carry this essence of yourself within you for the rest of your life. And what this film also shows is that there are people out there who are willing to accept that, even through the struggles that they have to undergo in order to accept you for who you are. And that is a sign, and one of the biggest signs of John Cassavetes' films, of love. In essence, to me, A Woman Under the Influence is, one of the great love stories, at least for me.
What do you think of his two other films that I mentioned, Husbands and Minnie and Moskowitz? You said that you consider Woman Under the Influence one of his great films. So I would assume you think that the other two films have some flaws. So why don't you give your opinions on both of those two earlier films? Husbands was 1970 and Minnie and Moskowitz 1971.
I would say I like Minnie and Moskowitz more than Husbands. Husbands, I struggled a bit. I remember when I first saw him. It was very heavy on the dialogue, and I don't know, I guess, how do I say this? It was almost just like following these guys just sort of broing out.
Yeah.
And I kind of missed that drama that Cassavetes presents when, you have relationships, you have couples, you have people of both genders going at it. To me, Husbands, I did struggle a bit through that. Now, Minnie and Moskowitz, I loved it. I thought it was quirky. I thought it was fun and still very strong and real and truthful to, the human drama. These two people who essentially need somebody and find unexpectedly the somebody that they need.
Yeah, it's probably Cassavetes' only film that might be considered a semi-comedy in a sense.
Right. I totally take that. Yeah, that's true.
Alex, what are your opinions about those three films, Husbands, Minnie and Moskowitz, and A Woman Under the Influence?
I'll start with A Woman Under the Influence. I think I do have a greater opinion of it than you, Dan. But I would strongly disagree with claims as it being Cassavetes' best. I think, in fact, that might be the norm. Most people consider either Faces or A Woman Under the Influence as his best. For me, the chief flaw in A Woman Under the Influence is the fact that whatever it depicts, it does depict exceptionally well, but it becomes very kind of just so reflexive in the sense that most of it revolves around this very nutty woman and the kind of troubles that she has and the things that she puts her family through. You don't always get that much characterization of the others involved. You simply have so much revolving around her. And Jenna Rollins' performance might be great, but it also is reflexive in the sense that this just depicts a very kind of particular individual that doesn't necessarily have much correspondence to anything else in the world. In that way, I would consider it similar to the Werner Herzog film, My Son, What Have You Done? I think it's a great depiction of, in that case, psychosis overall, but because it simply is so concerned with that, and particularly that, it doesn't necessarily branch out to much else that other human beings can really indulge in, can really engage with. It's also that way comparable to a poem like The Anecdote of the Jar by Wallace Stevens. It's so kind of caught up in what it's depicting that it forgets the fact that it's just too particular to its own self. And I think you could apply a similar thing to the characters within Love Streams. Beyond that, I do think there's a number of really standout scenes. There's where Peter Falk is going to work and he makes one of his coworkers fall and hurt himself. The way that that's presented, you have kind of this, I think it was a tractor kind of coming into the sunlight. There's implications there of things that are so much deeper than what you're simply seeing on the screen. And I think it's just a very stellar work in parts for that reason. Overall, again, it's just too reflexive to be anything more than that very kind of peculiar depiction. As far as the other films go, Minnie and Moskowitz, very odd film to me. On the one hand, it's interesting to see these two polar characters sort of falling in love with each other. And on the other hand, it's just not realistic. It's true that they have gotten married. It's true that they, in some ways, perhaps could have fallen in love with each other. But you also know that in the real world, such things cannot last. Cassavetes has always talked about this film as being, proof that passion can trump the mind, can trump intellectual instinct. And while this is true, you have to also mention the fact that passion can trump all these things, but the difference between passion and intellectual instinct is that passion by its nature is always temporary. You cannot sustain passion on passion alone. And to see these two characters literally simple to each other, Stephen Cassell's character act illuminating interactions between the three. Like Edwin said, they're kind of broing around. They're sort of having these contests with each other. They're supporting one another. They're making fun of one another. But beyond the things that they do to each other, you don't see anything underneath their relationship that should allow this sort of thing to flourish. Especially now in their 40s, you would expect to have some underpinnings, but you don't really see that. I think more interesting than the interactions that they have with one another is what they do individually. So when they take the three girls back in London and they're hanging around, I think those scenes are usually better than what happens when the three of them are together for that reason.
Now, let's end this segment. When we get back, I want to talk about, for me, the two other, I think, really great films, Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Opening Night from Cassavetes. And we're going to take a break, and we will. I will insert here a scene from Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and we'll take a little look at that and come back and talk about that with Edwin Nieves and Alex Sheramet in just a moment.
Just wanted to drop by and say hi, see how you were feeling.
So the Fu Manchu mustaches. And they're very uptight, They're very resentful because they don't know whether they're Chinese American or American Chinese. His name is Ling.
Well, what does he do?
Well, he's a bookie. Chinese bookie. See, what we need you for is this. We've got this little problem. And you can help us out. Well, that's what we're talking about. See,
Wait a minute. I think I understand. I'm not dumb, but I'm not a fool. You're going to be one.
Did you call him a fool, Mort? Did I call you a fool? Nobody called you a fool.
That's good.
Be smart, Connie.
This guy owes us money. He's got to pay. I want to reduce the debt, but not get rid of it.
So you want to reduce the debt, but not get rid of it. Is that right?
Yeah.
How much?
boys. Look.
Mr. Vitelli, the first rule of a good businessman is to know what you're talking about. Now, Mr. Vitelli, what are you talking about? Wait a minute, fellas. We're going too fast.
We're going too fast.
Yeah, fast.
And back with Alex Sharamet and Edwin Nieves. And in between segments, I will have played a little bit of a scene from The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And in that scene, we see Cosmo Vitelli, the Ben Gazzara character, basically being coerced by these mafioso types. And for me, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie is the greatest, at least American gangster film that I've seen. I think it's better than Goodfellas. I think it's better than The Godfather. And the reason it's better on a very surface level is the gangsters are much more realistic. The only other film that I've ever seen where American gangsters are as realistically portrayed is actually in another independent filmmaker, Jim Jarmusch, his film Ghost Dog. When you watch a film like Goodfellas, or when you watch The Godfather, Godfather has the Shakespearean kind of mobsters. Goodfellas has a sort of MTV cool mobsters. But these guys are real idiots. And as we saw in that scene, you have guys who are probably the head of a mob crew. You have the one guy, hey, this guy owes us money. You know, the mook, the real dumbass who's the threatening guy. And it's just an odd assortment of characters. And so, in my opinion, that film, and I think both versions, the shorter version and the longer version, the original version, are both great, but the longer version, I think, is the greater film. Let's talk a little bit about that film as a film and also as a gangster film. So I don't know if Edwin or Alex wants to chime in first. Edwin, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Now I'm glad you brought it up because I do love gangster films. My favorite is Le Samurai, by the way.
Yeah.
By Jean-Pierre Melville.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, like, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie would have been if instead of Melville presenting Jeff Costello and Le Samurai his, structured story, it'd be like following him going shopping or talking to a friend for a bit and then going about his own business. And, I love how John Cassavetes, he takes a gangster film and still says, it's still going to be a Cassavetes film. I'm still going to give you, real people. I'm not going to give you the plotted lines. The whole story, like, there's a difference in cinema between a plotted story and a natural story. In this one, it's very natural that we just follow this guy and his, his life. He's the owner of this club, a strip joint. And he owes these guys money, and now he has to do them a favor. We don't get set up with that. We're just presenting that. And then how he goes about it is also still very Cassavetes, still natural, still as realistic. And like you brought up the gangsters, they're real gangsters,
Yeah, and the thing with that film is you get the protagonist, Cosmo Vitelli, is probably not that nice of a guy. He basically gets into trouble because he's trying to impress his stripper girlfriend, so he overbets, and that's what gets him in debt. And what we later find out too is what assumed is, he knows, at one point he says, I want to reduce the debt, but I don't want to get rid of it. Meaning basically, I'll pay you guys, but I don't want to kill someone. Yet we end up seeing he's a very efficient killer. And probably the only weak moment in the film that I can think of is maybe the scene where that mook guy, this guy owes us money, and him fight, because Cosmo, it's not a very realistic fight. And you have the sense that Cosmo, I think he might have served in the military, that Cosmo could probably take him, but he knows at this point that if he does, he's going to be killed. He goes, he kills the bookie. The other guys try to kill him. And the film ends. He's been shot. He goes to his girlfriend's mother's home. He goes to back to the club. And the film just ends with him. Basically, he's either going to be hunted down or he's going to bleed out and die. Probably 20 or 30 minutes after that last scene, he's probably going to be dead. And it's just such a terrific ending. And Ben Gazzara dominates, in my opinion, the screen. Like, if there's 10 or 12 film performances where one actor just dominates the screen, this is one of those performances. So, Alex, what are your thoughts on the film, on both versions? Let's talk about the long version first, and then we'll talk about the edited version. So, Alex, if you want to.
Yeah. Killing with Chinese Bookie, the long version in particular, it is my favorite film of all time. Not only is it my favorite film, I also consider it one of the greatest films ever made in any genre or time period. And I wish Marshall Fine actually were here, because I know that he has a negative take on the film in his biography, and when he's talking about the film itself. He goes into some critiques of the structure. He critiques the burlesque shows and calls them one of the weakest portion of the film. And anyway, I consider it one of the greatest films ever made. Beyond the fact that it has realistic gangsters and whatnot. It has this inner drive, this really strong inner poetic drive that you don't see in most gangster films. As great as Godfather is, or Goodfellas, or even Mean Streets are, there's so much underneath this film, in terms of psychology, in terms of the symbolism that goes beyond pretty much any film of this genre ever made. On a basic level, if you look at something like the burlesque show, on the one hand, some people might say, there are some scenes that go a little bit too long, but the fact is you absolutely need this portion of the film, and you need it for reasons that are not at all immediately apparent. You look at the burlesque show, and you have Mr. Sophistication there, and he's so clearly some sort of analog to Cosmo Vitelli himself, and also in some ways perhaps even to John Cassavetes, where he's part of these kinds of odd, pretentious shows, and yet he takes them so seriously. And he becomes envious of the girls for getting the attention that they get, and he doesn't seem to get that sort of attention. And he takes all of this seriously, and in a sense, you could see Cosmo Vitelli as he kind of sits with the girls, and he gambles, and he buys things that he can't afford, and he does things that are very much outside of his ordinary human reach. There's this connection between the two, and near the end, when he's in the back of the club and he's giving a pep talk to the girls, and they start singing, and he goes downstairs and he introduces the show, and he talks about Rachel and the fact that she's gone. There's this feeling that, and people often make this claim that the film is about the show must go on, and it's not about the burlesque show. It's not about that show going on. If that burlesque show itself, it's very much meaningless, and you don't know exactly what Cassavetes himself wants to go on. You don't know what Cosmo wants to perpetuate, and yet there's this feeling that there's this drive that simply needs to progress. Something needs to be allowed to kind of play out its course. And this is recapitulated by the fact that you don't see what happens to Cosmo Vitelli at the very end. You could make certain guesses, but nothing is truly a guarantee there. It's allowed to sort of play out its course. And you have so many other scenes in between. You have that first scene where he meets with the loan shark, and then Gazzara gives him that very long, intense stare. You don't see the loan shark. You simply see Gazzara's eyes. You don't have acting moments like that in most films. And as it goes on, there's literally in every single scene, there's countless of little moments that you could point to that really fit, that characterize Gazzara, that characterize the rest, and that really propel the film's basic themes forward. And this is despite the fact that it goes on for almost 2.5 hours. And, that's a very, very rare kind of achievement.
Yeah. And Alex, you mentioned that scene, that was right at the beginning. And before we talk about the controversy about the cut that made that film shorter, I want to talk a little bit about the acting of the non-Gazzara characters, because I think that's a very important part of this film. But that scene that you mentioned, I know when we talked in the first Dan Schneider video interview about the Woody Allen canon, there's a scene in Another Woman, the one film that Jenna Rollins starred in for Woody Allen, where there's a scene between her and one of her friends where they talk, and they're talking about what ended their friendship, and Jenna Rollins says, "Oh, are you talking about that thing about David?" And we never find out what the thing between the two women with David was. And in the same way, we see Cosmo with this loan shark that he's into somehow, and he pays him off, and we never find out what's going on. And I think that's one of the things that Cassavetes got, because so many filmmakers would have to go in and say, we have to explain who that character was. We need more extrapolation. We need to open it up. But we don't really need to know, because that tells you the kind of people that Cosmo Vitelli is around. And I just wanted to put that out there. But let me get back to Edwin and you and talk about the acting, about some of the other characters. I believe the blonde fella, Seymour Cassell, I think it is the mobster. He was the guy from Faces, the young guy. And he's sort of the guy who he's sort of luring Ben Gazzara's Cosmo into trouble with the debt. And at the end, he's the guy who is the last guy, I believe, to come after Gazzara with a gun. And once Cosmo kills him, basically, he's gonna be extinguished at some point. But there's so many of those medium characters that we saw in the scene that opened up this segment. Even in just 5 or 6 minute appearances, you get to know these types of characters. But they're not like, there's that famous scene in Goodfellas where the camera pans down one of the bars, and they say, and there's Johnny Boy, and there's Vito, and everyone sort of, chimes up and looks up at the camera. You don't get that in this film, and yet even in these small little acting performances, you get to know that world. So Edwin, let me ask you, were there any other characters or acting performances in the film of the lesser characters that stood out to you, whether it was the gangsters, whether it was the strippers, or the black stripper and her mother? What stood out other than Gazzara to you?
I mean, what stood out is, I guess, maybe let's call the camera an actor as well.
Yeah.
Whereas with Goodfellas and The Godfather, again, the camera is very, you can get a screenshot and it looks like a painting. It looks well composed. Here, again, you get, and I think this might be the reason, or it just supports the psychological realism of the gangsters, but the camera is very, human. It's as if you were there with them. And I think because Cassavetes brings his direction with the camera from the other films to this one into essentially a gangster film, which, you would think Hollywood wants it in a certain way. They want the establishing shot. They want this nice shot. Or in Goodfellas, is it Goodfellas? Yeah, Goodfellas, when Robert De Niro meets with Ray Liotta, and we have that Hitchcock shot. There's no extravagant technique in this one, and I think that very well supports the psychological realism behind the gangsters. That the camera itself is very human. We're not using the camera in order to create. We're using the camera in order to capture.
Yeah, and Alex, how about you? Were there any acting performances, or were there any techniques, as Edwin talks about the camera? Were there any techniques? Maybe was there any the soundtrack? I think you had mentioned the soundtrack.
I actually rewatched the film yesterday in preparation for this interview, and as far as the soundtrack goes, there's a very minimal soundtrack, and yet the sounds that do make it into the film, they very much repel it. There's both a menacing portion to it, there are parts to it that I think recap much of what I'd say the beauty of the film. And I hate to use the word beauty when it comes to art, but Bookie is one of the only works of art that I'd ever use that adjective for. You have, for example, Bill Harwood's track that goes on when Gazara's character gets that girl to quote unquote audition for him. Things like that don't necessarily seem to fit, and yet upon multiple viewings of the film, these are soundtracks that very much work. There's a danger portion to it. There's the beautiful portion to it, and they all fit into exactly the kind of thing that you see happening on screen. As far as the techniques and the acting goes, even like that idiot mobster played by Tim Curry that seems to always like kind of pipe up and give these sorts of dangerous growls while everybody else is trying to be I guess falsely nice to Cosmo Vitelli. You do see an arc of a character even with him. He goes from being this kind of a gruff, almost Neanderthal type of man to near the end, he says that he refuses to kill Cosmo Vitelli because he develops this strong respect for him, and he starts to talk about his childhood. He starts talking about money. He starts talking about his own father growing up. And these are rants that really have nothing really to do with what's going on, and yet on a deeper level they do, because these are the things and the underpinnings of the film itself. So you have this character that he has such brief appearances, and he seems to be this complete nobody, and yet in a sense he's probably in some ways the deepest of the gangsters that you see.
Right, and let me just interrupt you for 1 second, Alex, because you mentioned, and I was trying to think who the name was, and I don't have as much time to research.
Who's also in that nice restaurant scene in Minnie Moskowitz.
Yeah, but he's also the character that was in the 2 Kubrick films, Paths of Glory, where he played one of the French guys that get killed, and he's also in, I believe, The Killing, where he plays the guy who shoots the jockey off the horse. And The Killing was Stanley Kubrick's first studio film, and it was one of the first, or actually was an independent film picked up by a studio, and it's a very seminal film too in independent filmmaking. And I had forgotten that, but now that when you mentioned the name, I said that's right. And he specialized in playing these kind of like dopey, odd, weird kind of characters. Anyway, is there any other comments regarding any acting? And if not, then let's go on to the 2 different versions of the film.
There's a few more that I can just think off the top of my head. There's also I believe it's Robert Meade that plays Mr. Sophistication, who's a friend of Cassavetes and a playwright in real life. When you have, for example, when he's on stage and he's giving his little speeches, his little performances, and the girls are coming behind him and they either kind of, show their asses or their tits, or they make like a flame coming out of his shoulder. And he absolutely hates this. And you see this kind of look coming over his face, this kind of resignation that, he wishes that he mattered more. He wishes that he would be the one that's being cheered on. And again, this goes back to Cassavetes himself as a human being. This goes back to Cosmo Vitelli as a character and perhaps as a real life person. These little things that seem to be kind of off kilter and disconnected, they really go back to themselves, and they crisscross and they crosshatch, and they do everything that's supposed to happen in a great film for that reason. The strippers themselves, they do a really fantastic job, especially in that the last scene where they're all being kind of prodded to go out and make their money. All of these things really work together. That this goes beyond just Ben Gazzara himself. Great performance, but I think, like you said, these other characters they definitely have a very strong contribution that again is not very apparent the first time that you watch the film. It does take multiple viewings.
Okay, so let's talk though, because Chinese Bookie, just like Shadows, has 2 versions, and in fact, in the Criterion Collection, John Cassavetes' five films collection, we actually get both versions. unlike the Shadows one where one of the versions was sort of a bootleg by Ray Carney or whatnot that Ray Carney had gotten a hold of. First, I want Alex to give us a little background about the film, and I want to talk to Edwin about the concept of re-editing a film that you may or may not have been aware of. So, Alex, why don't you give us a 2 or 3 minute summary of why Cassavetes went back in and recut the film, and it went from, I think, 135 to 109 minutes, so almost a half-hour cut, and then we'll talk with Edwin about what a director does in that kind of situation. So, Alex, why don't you give us the background?
So, for those that don't know, Chinese Bookie, when it was being made, everybody involved, from Ben Gazzara to Cassavetes to Al Rubin, Bo Harwood, as they were making the film, they had this very strong feeling that this was such a magnificent and unbelievably done film. They thought that perhaps in some ways this might have been Cassavetes' best work to date. And on top of that, they also felt that beyond it being a great work of art, it would also have great commercial success because, here was a gangster film at a time when gangster films were becoming more popular, and yet here was the gangster film that offered things that other gangster films did not. So it felt that, it had not only a niche market, but also things that it could offer to audience members that it can't get anywhere else, even as they were, in love with this kind of genre. So, they were very excited to release the film. They released the film, and it was by far, even more so than Husbands, it was by far the least successful of Cassavetes' releases. It was completely savage critically. Some theaters had very few people appearing, and those that did show up, at first you'd had large numbers of people showing up to see the film, and very quickly after that, they would start leaving the theaters and they would tell the people online, like, hey, get the fuck off the line. This film is a piece of shit. Don't see it. It's a complete waste of time. And everybody was very shocked at this kind of response. They were shocked at the critics. They were shocked at the audience response. And after 6 days in New York City, it was actually pulled from theaters. So Cassavetes, it's not so much that he was unsatisfied with the artistic quality of the film, but I think perhaps he did feel like if he were to cut it down a bit, it would have an easier running time. Maybe he would be able to change around some of the aspects of it that audience members didn't like without necessarily compromising the art. And I'm not sure if he did this to save face or what, but he did ultimately say that he saw very little difference between the two versions. As far as, he obviously saw the difference in plot line, and maybe one was a little bit more conventional in the narrative sense. But he did say that artistically, he doesn't see much of a difference between the two. I do see a difference. I think both versions are great, but there to me is a clear artistic gulf between the longer version and the shorter version, with the longer version being superior. The shorter version makes things a little more conventional in the sense that it follows a more kind of A to B to C narrative. It spends less time on these sort of long-winded characterizations, which make the film basically less deep. It makes it more conventional and easier to follow in some ways, but it does in the end make it a bit less deep. And that's really the major difference between the two versions.
So, Edwin, let me just get your comment first. Do you agree that you think the longer version is better than the shorter version? And let's say, 5 or 10 years from now, if you had a film, whether it was independent, let's say you had your own druthers and you didn't, and you had the final cut on a film, and you really believed in the work, and it got savage, would you go back and cut it? So, 2 parts. What do you think about the 2 versions of this film? And about the situation about a director feeling he has to cut something to maybe appeal to a mass audience.
Definitely with the longer version, more in depth. You're diving further into that sea. Yeah. That is the film. With the shorter one, I don't blame Cassavetes for re-editing it, because as a filmmaker, a lot of the times when you release a film, it's sort of do or die. And he probably did choose the best thing for himself as an artist filmmaker at that time. However, even though he did say, like Alex said, that he didn't see much of a difference. I bet you he felt there was a difference between the two.
Yeah.
That, without a doubt, I can't imagine a filmmaker not knowing the essence of the film that he wanted or she wanted to present being changed. 24 minutes is a lot of time.
Yeah.
To cut down. So you're cutting down a lot of meat. Because I imagine when he did get the 130-minute one, he already cut down the fat that he thought wasn't necessary. So to cut down the meat of it must have hurt a bit. But again, as a filmmaker too, you have to understand that the film is for the audience. Yeah. As an artist, whenever you're creating a work, you're creating for the public. If not, then it's basically like writing into your diary or your journal, and you're just keeping it to yourself, which is good if, creativity is a process that allows you to express yourself, explore yourself, and also being like a healing process. But if you're being a professional artist, you do have to think about your public at all times. And I think when he said he doesn't see much of a difference, he was probably saying that as an artist, he still is expressing his voice there. There's still John Cassavetes there. It's just shorter. And it's more accessible to a larger audience, which, considering that it is a gangster film, he needs to reach a larger audience.
Well, let's talk now. The shorter version came out in 1978. I believe it took 2 years. And sandwiched in between the two versions of Chinese Bookie was the release of Opening Night in 1987. And if Ben Gazzara is the dominant force in the Chinese Bookie, both versions of that film, to me, the best performance in Jenna Rollins' career in Cassavetes' canon, and I haven't seen Love Stream, so I can't comment on that, but of the films that I've seen, she dominates Opening Night, and I would say it's the only other film that I've seen outside of Cassavetes' canon with Jenna Rollins that I would say is in a class or maybe a little bit superior is Another Woman by Woody Allen that she's in. But let's talk about Opening Night 1977. This is basically about a woman who, I don't know if you would call it stage fright or she has some kind of neuroses. She's an actress. She's a name. Her play is about to open on Broadway, I believe. She tries to steady herself by doing, I think she goes to a psychic or she goes to all kinds of extreme methods to get herself righted. I think she's an alcoholic, or if she's not an alcoholic, she does have a drinking problem. Let's talk about that film. Where would you say, Edwin, place that film in the Cassavetes canon and also in Jenna Rollins' acting performance?
Definitely, when I had mentioned A Woman Under the Influence being on my top, it's these three in succession, including Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Opening Night, that are, to me, the top three.
Yeah.
And for various reasons, I can't quite say which one is number one because each one has its own distinct appeal. Again, Killing Chinese Bookie, awesome gangster film. A Woman Under the Influence, something I haven't seen. But then Opening Night is, you're not only exploring this actress's world, but you're also exploring the process of creating something. In this case, a Broadway show, which I definitely like, and it reminds me the most recent Birdman is essentially sort of like this. But as far as Jenna Rollins' performances, yeah, this is definitely in the top. I would say along with A Woman Under the Influence, but this one, sometimes it's easier to applaud a performance that shows neurosis, shows the craziness, but this one, she kind of instills it inside her, so you kind of have to search for it a little bit more. So perhaps there's more finesse to the performance in Opening Night.
Alex, what's your take on Opening Night? And
I agree as far as the performances. Well, first, I would put in the top three Cassavetes. Chinese Bookie is definitely one. Opening Night would be either 2 or 3, tied with Faces. But as far as the performance, it's a lot easier for people to look at something like a woman under the influence and say, isn't this such a magnificent performance? Because Jenna Rollins, because of the nature of the character she's playing in that film, she has to be over the top. She has to be dramatic in the kind of conventional sense of what people would think of when they hear the word dramatic. Here, the performance, just like with Another Woman, it has to be understated. For example, you have her conversations with the writer of the play. Whenever she meets this old lady, and this lady's trying to teach Jenna Rollins things about youth and adulthood and everything in between. Jenna Rollins, she clearly oscillates in between being empathetic towards her words and understanding them to just being completely dismissive. And this could happen within a single scene, within a single minute. You could have this kind of oscillation. You have those kinds of movements all the time. This back and forth movement is just happening all the time. That film, it just makes for a far more subtle performance. On top of the fact that the film itself, it has the element of having that metafictional part to have a kind of this play within a play within a film. There's things going on between the other characters that both characterize them, despite the fact that they could play just such a minor role at times. And Jenna Rollins herself and the kind of choices that she could make. There's also the fact that near the end, I find it a very ambiguous ending. On the one hand, it's very triumphant. On the other hand, she ends up exorcising this kind of demon that she feels is afflicting her. This ghost that's following her and trying to kill her. And yet, after this success and after getting rid of this spirit that she feels has been pretty much hanging on her life, not only after the killing of the girl early on in the film, but also it seems for much of her life in general. Despite doing all this, she does show up to this tremendous performance that she has to give. She shows up completely drunk, drunk to the point that she cannot stand. And it really does call into doubt the ultimate success that she has in that play at the very end of the film. You do wonder, will this success in the play translate to other parts of her life? Because she may be a great actress, she may be great at what she does in her professional life, but she clearly has these afflictions that have not been resolved even after the film's ostensible kind of a demon that's haunting her. Even after that's gotten rid of, it still does not really seem to fix anything for her. And that's an interesting way to look at it. And it also bellies the kinds of things that Cassavetes might say about the film himself.
Yeah, one of the things in Cassavetes' film, it's almost as important what he doesn't tell you about the characters or the situations as what he does. For example, in Faces, we don't really know what's at the root cause of some of the problems of some of the characters. We don't really know why, for example, the guys and husbands are dissatisfied with their lives. They seem to be in pretty good places. We don't know, for example, about Cosmo Vitelli's past. He seems to be an apt killer. Was he formerly in much more deep in the mob and somehow got out and got dragged back in? Somehow maybe working for the CIA or something. I think he mentions a military past. Here in Opening Night, we don't really know what's wrong with the character of Myrtle. Is she an alcoholic? Is she just a neurotic or whatnot? And we're not given that. And that's sort of like real life. And I think that's one of the things that is Cassavetes' strength. But anyway, let us end this segment. And when I come back in the next segment, I want to talk about some of Cassavetes' later films, the minor films he directed, and also just a little bit about his just acting-only career. And we'll do that in just a moment with Edwin and Alex.
His films didn't end. They weren't tied up at the end. They just stopped. It was never neat. And that's the way it is in life.
But that's life. that was again so breathtaking for him to finish on that note, because that's how it is. You don't go out with a bang, with a whimper. They just went on.
In this segment, I want to talk with Alex and Edwin about some of the later films and the minor films of Cassavetes, and I also want to talk a bit about his acting only career. Looking at the filmography of Cassavetes, I didn't mention two early films called Too Late Blues, 1961, A Child is Waiting, 1963. Then there are three later films, Gloria, 1980, Love Streams, 84, and Big Trouble, 86. Alex, I have only seen Gloria, and I saw that many years ago as a youth, and I remember it was a good, solid film. I'd put it probably, if I was to rewatch it, just looking back in my head, it's probably in the Husbands mini, maybe the Mini Moskowitz level, that it's got some prose, but it's a minor work. Excuse me. I know Edwin said that he saw Love Streams, and you've seen Love Streams as well. So since Alex, you've seen some of these other minor and later films, why don't you take us through starting from Too Late Blues and A Child is Waiting, and just give us a brief summary and your opinion on those films.
So Too Late Blues, it follows, it's a little bit similar to Shadows in some regard, in the sense that it has a jazz background. It follows a group of musicians that are kind of at this crossroads, or wondering if they should continue playing their music, or if they should in some way sell out. It's never explicitly stated that they would do either, but the leader of the group, Ghost, he eventually ends up leaving them to kind of strike out on his own. Overall, I'd say it's a fairly interesting film. There's lines that's memorable. There's acting that's memorable. The entire idea that there's this group of people that have to more or less sacrifice their dreams for some kind of a commercial stake, because they feel they're getting older and they're not really getting anywhere. It does go back to a lot of things that Cassavetes himself might feel about working, his work life, the kinds of things that he must have experienced when he was making films. The later film, A Child is Waiting, it basically had to go through too many cuts and too many manipulations for me to really consider it a Cassavetes film. The way that he originally tried to film the script, and it's not his script, he might have made some additions to, but it's not his script. The way that he tried to film it originally is this film that's about a school for retarded children, and the kinds of things that a woman teacher that comes in, she wants to make some changes, the kinds of things that she ends up doing. He wanted to film this movie by focusing much more on the children, the kinds of things they might say or think, and the spontaneous interactions they would have with each other and with the adults on the set. Originally, this was the intention, but he was not allowed to do that. So it ends up becoming just a more conventional take on, this is what these institutions look like. This is their capacity. This is what they do. In a sense, in some ways, it might be a little bit of an ad, even though if you could consider it kind of like early propaganda, it's much more well executed propaganda than you would typically see in art today. For example, I still remember a number of lines that characters will tell each other about these children that show that, they're not, condescending to them in a way that contemporary educators do, and, they don't think anything of it. There's this one line where you have two characters speaking to each other, and one father of a retarded child is saying things like, is that all there is? My child is going to have a job, tying string to a package. Is that all that he's going to be able to accomplish? And the one of the directors of the school ends up saying something like, that might be all that he's able to accomplish, but I sometimes wonder how much the rest of us really accomplish. And it's a very kind of killer line, because, for most people, they don't really end up accomplishing much in the cosmic sense, and the kinds of deprecation that they would have towards, other forms of existence, despite this fact, it really kind of highlights the hypocrisy. So both of those films, I think they have some things going for them. Too Late Blues is the better film overall.
How about Gloria Love Streams and Big Trouble?
I haven't seen Big Trouble. That's the only one I have not seen because, in preparation for this interview, I wanted to, focus on the Cassavetes stuff. When it comes to Big Trouble, it's so far beyond what Cassavetes wanted. He didn't want to have a director credit. He did not want to have a script credit, and it was forced upon him anyway. So this, to me, I consider it essentially not even his film. As far as Gloria goes, I'd agree with you. Overall, a solid film. I wouldn't really call it good overall. The difference between something like Husbands and Gloria is in the fact that Husbands, for all of its low points, it does have a number of really great and brilliant high points. Gloria does not really have any high points. It simply has a kind of solid plateau. It plateaus out actually fairly early on. So it's not a film I would really put anywhere in the top 3, top 5 of things that he's done for that reason.
Now, Love Streams, you recently wrote a review of, so I would just give a little capsule of your opinion of that film, and then Edwin said that this was the other film of Cassavetes of those 5 that he has seen. So, Alex, why don't you give your opinion, and then Edwin?
Yeah, so Love Streams is I consider it the last true Cassavetes film, and it follows a writer named Robert Harmon. And his sister, that we don't learn is his sister until well into the film, Sarah Lawson, who's played by Jenna Rollins, and Harmon is played by Cassavetes. They're filmed kind of independently of each other for a while. You sort of see them doing their own things. Sarah's going through a divorce from her husband Jack, who's played by Timo Cassell. Meanwhile, Robert Harmon is working on his next book. And to have research for his next book, he kind of sets up this harem in his own house where he invites his girls over. He talks to them. He sleeps with them. He tries to, what he calls, get at a beautiful woman's secret. He wants to know what women's secrets really are. And they're kind of doing this for a little while. Eventually, they meet up with each other, and you see what the brother and sister relationship is really like. It's a film that in many ways it's just very, very odd in some ways, because just like with a Woman Under the Influence, Sarah is this character that, although Cassavetes hated this description, she is very much a nut job. In one of the film's best scenes, because she feels that Robert needs to have something that he could love, she decides to go find him a pet. But instead of just finding him a single pet, like a normal person would, she goes into this animal shelter and she brings by two miniature horses. She brings by like a couple of parrots. She has a dog brought in. She has a goat brought in, and she thinks this is a great idea. And very quickly she realizes it's not a good idea, at which point she faints. And throughout, you just kind of see these interactions with one another, just kind of very odd. You don't really see too much behind, just like in Husbands, you don't really see too much behind their relationships. You don't really see why they're even with each other, why they love each other so much, except for the fact that they're brother and sister. But at this point, they're adults that are very different from one another. They have a very different set of values. You really wonder why they're even drawn to each other at this point, at this late in their adulthood. In the end, there's also this one odd scene that Cassavetes just absolutely loved. Near the end, when Sarah leaves to stay with her new boyfriend, Robert Harmon is sitting in his apartment, or rather his home, and he's bonding with the dog, and the dog is sitting in this chair, and suddenly the dog disappears, and in its place there's a guy that's sitting in the chair without a shirt on, that the dog supposedly kind of turns into. And Cassavetes asks, well, who the fuck are you? And then he just starts laughing maniacally at this. And Cassavetes thought this was a very kind of, intuitive leap, a very kind of, cutesy and negative capability sort of thing. But to me, it's just very weird, a very odd way to end a film. That's kind of a Withers in a nutshell. I feel like it captures the best of Cassavetes' most brilliant moments in cinema, and also captures some of his worst. I think that way it was an interesting way to kind of send off his career for that reason.
Edwin, your take?
That was a very interesting note to take. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this one still carries the core of what John Cassavetes is always trying to explore, which is, in its very basic form, love. And love not just through relationships, but just love between human beings, whether brother, sister, husband, wife, whatnot. My only take on this was where the other ones, all his films are very personal, but the other ones reflect his personal philosophy to life. I feel like maybe Love Streams is a little bit more reflecting his personal experiences of life, like things that happened to him that he wants to explore on film. It's perhaps the film that he wanted to cinematically tell his life story to an audience. For that reason, I couldn't get quite engaged as with the other ones. I really couldn't say much more about Love Streams in that way. I did enjoy it, but it didn't hit me as hard as A Woman Under the Influence or Opening Night.
Okay. Now, I'm looking here just on the IMDb page, and Cassavetes had looks like about 80 or more acting credits on both television and cinema. And this basically was his way of having a paycheck to help fund his own films. And in looking over, other than the acting he did in his own films, and he starred on Columbo, which was Peter Falk's television series and whatnot, 3 films stood out to me. His most famous role is probably in Rosemary's Baby. The other film, 2 films that stood out to me that I recall seeing, there was a film called Mikey and Nicky in 1976 where Elaine May, the comedian turned film director, had Falk and Cassavetes starring in. And as I recall, it was very much in the husband's kind of style. And the third film that his acting only film that stuck with me was a film called The Killers from 1964, and I believe that was based upon the story by Ernest Hemingway, and he plays one of the killers. And I remember he actually gave, I think, the best performance in the film. It's a film that also starred Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson as the 2 leads, but Cassavetes, in a sense, stole the show. Do either of you, Edwin or Alex, have you seen any of those 3 films or any other films that stuck in your mind, his acting performance? And how would you rate Cassavetes as an actor? Let me start with Edwin first. What is your take on Cassavetes as an actor, and is there any film performance outside of his own directed films that stands out in your mind?
I have seen The Killers and Rosemary's Baby. Cassavetes as an actor, he knows how to act. And I think that's why he's such a great actor's director, because he knows what goes on in an actor's mind. He knows how to fish for those performances. Yeah, he has a presence about him. Like, you can feel him on the screen when he walks on. He really pulls you in with his performances. And I wonder if it's because of his very carefree, outgoing personality. But regardless of that, I think it would have been an awesome experience for any director to work with him. Especially, too, considering that he is a director as well. He could provide a director with certain ideas that most actors wouldn't be able to, I think.
In those, what would you say is your opinion, what was his best acting role that he didn't direct himself in?
Oh, all right. I'm just, maybe it's just personal, but I do like The Killers, and that might be because that's probably my favorite Ernest Hemingway short story.
Okay, Alex, what are your thoughts on the Cassavetes non-directing acting roles, and was there any one that stood out to you?
So I did not see the killers of the ones that you mentioned. There was an early one actually. I believe before he directed any films, called "Saddle of the Wind," which surprisingly it was written by Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame, and also surprisingly it was not very well written. But the only real thing about the film that I think is a good feature of the film is in the fact that you have John Cassavetes playing the character of Tony, who's the brother of the film's protagonist, and pretty much from the very beginning you see when the camera goes on Cassavetes that he's just well beyond the other actors within. You see the little ticks in his face. You see the sort of things that he does with his eyes. You see even small things like where he puts his hands or where they might go in the midst of him walking. Things that are both very natural and also very much characterizing both parts of him that are kind of normal and the parts of him that are eventually shown to be very kind of evil and sociopathic. These things like take on deeper meanings when you watch the film a second and third time. So I always thought that was a very interesting performance in a film that's otherwise not a very good film.
Yeah, I got an up on IMDb, Saddle in the Wind. It looks like John Sturges, a fairly well-known director, was an uncredited there, and Robert Parrish is a name, the director I'm not familiar with, but that's an interesting choice. Have you seen Rosemary's Baby?
Yeah, I've seen Rosemary's Baby. I think his performance there is more or less limited by just the nature of the film.
Yeah,
it's very much just kind of like it's very much an entertainment film. It's something that it can be taken in only one or two levels, either literally or not. But either way that you take it, it doesn't really come out to be too interesting. Either on Mia Farrow's character or when you get into the psychology of John Cassavetes' character within that film, there's nothing really interesting for him to latch on to. I can't really say that he does a great job there, and he hated the film himself. So perhaps that comes out in the performance.
Yeah.
Probably the most interesting of the actor only performances is maybe Mikey and Nikki. And I don't think too much of the film itself, but like you said, it is very much in the husband's vein. They are just kind of carousing. They are bonding with each other, and you do see things that clearly Cassavetes probably either wrote into the script or maybe thought up on the spot. Both the performances from Cassavetes and Falk are pretty good in that film.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll wrap things up. I just want to end the final segment, talk a little bit about any comments either of you may have on his technical skills as a director. I want to talk a little bit about what his legacy is to any other film directors that are currently working, perhaps, and then just give you some closing remarks. And we'll do that in a moment with Alex and Edwin.
People die at 21. They die emotionally at 21, maybe even younger now. For those of us who are lucky not to die at 20, we keep on going. And my responsibility as an artist is to help people get over 21. The films are a roadmap through emotional and intellectual terrains that provide a solution to how one can save pain. As people, we know that we are petty, vicious, violent, and horrible. But my films make an effort to contain the depression within us and to limit the depression to those areas that we can actually solve. The resolution of the films is the assertion of a human spirit.
This is Dan Schneider again, and I'm going to end our show here on John Cassavetes' life and career, speaking with Edwin and Alex. And I just wanted to give both my guests their final say on Cassavetes' legacy, if there are any filmmakers out there doing anything similar, Any other comments on technical, any other aspects that have gone on set, and just a final closing remark on Cassavetes. So, Edwin, why don't you opine, if you will, on any of those aspects?
All right. Yeah, I think John Cassavetes overall has inspired and influenced many filmmakers, and even I would say internationally. With the American directors, you have people like Jim Jarmusch, even Martin Scorsese, and then just the spirit of Cassavetes, that spirit of independent filmmaking, you can even find in the Turkish filmmaker Nuri Bilge Ceylan.
Yeah.
He at a late age, he started making his own films his own way on his own, and now he even owns his own production company that goes under his name. And that right there attests to what Cassavetes was all about, was, creating personal films with personal stories under your own rules and not letting other people get in the way of the truth that you want to reveal. And that is very important too for filmmakers today, because, we have already, there's nothing wrong with entertainment. And we have that. I think it's time for more truth, more art in filmmaking, and Cassavetes is definitely one who has shed a light on that path.
Yeah, Ceylan, I'm glad you mentioned him, because I think he's one of the top 2 or 3 filmmakers. I'd put him up there with Steve McQueen and Climates, and Once Upon a Time in Anatolia. A great films. Anatolia, I think, was a masterpiece. The only one of his mature films I think stumbled a little bit was Three Monkeys, but that's still a very good film.
Right.
But hopefully one of these days I could interview him. But Alex, why don't you wrap up any final thoughts you have about Cassavetes' legacy, and any final comment?
Just to add on to what everybody was saying, one of the interesting lenses through which to view Cassavetes now is through the critical lens, in the sense that he gives a very interesting glimpse to a critic's psyche over the years, because he died in 1989, and that's still fairly recent. It's recent enough that we can still really feel the kind of neglect that he experienced in his lifetime, and yet we're far away enough that we're able to witness the kind of revitalization that his films are allowed to go through now, and they were not allowed to go through during his lifetime. And when I think about the kinds of things that he had to go through, the kinds of city that he had to put up with, the kinds of critical negligence, the Pauline Kaels and the Vincent Cambys, and all the idiots that he had to put up with nonstop, it just very much angers me. And it angers me that he was never supported in his life when he could have used it. And now so many of the critics that were bashing him before, to kind of make up for it, he's now, treated as this kind of visionary. And in between the kind of idea that he was a complete waste of talent, and then again he was a complete visionary, people lose really who he was as an artist. He was somebody that created a number of truly great films, including one that is above and beyond virtually any film that has been made in history, which is Bookie. And he's also somebody that had quite a few missteps. And you cannot go from one idiotic extreme and then swing all other and hope that you're able to find some kind of truth in that. You won't. You need to be able to see the stupidity for what it was, the neglect for what it was, and you're supposed to be able to look at the films now with fresh eyes and be able to see what works and what doesn't. And you have to be fair to both parts. You have to be fair on both accounts. As far as any contemporary filmmakers that he's influenced, in some ways, I think Cassavetes, at least parts of his filmmaking, could be considered a dead end. Even if it's great filmmaking, it is a dead end. It's very hard to apply to your own filmmaking without making the influence be so obvious. But in David Gordon Green's first 2 films, George Washington and All the Real Girls, I definitely see a very strong sort of John Cassavetes feel. You do have interactions that actors have with one another that do seem spontaneous, that do seem off the cuff, even if they're kind of overlaid with the whole kind of Terrence Malick feel. You have those kinds of influences there. I don't think, though, Cassavetes is somebody that you could simply use in your own art without making the debt be anything less than obvious.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned David Gordon Green, because interspersed between some of our segments, other than the two clips that we watched and to analyze, I have some clips from A Constant Forge, the great documentary that was done about him a decade or so ago. And, Cassavetes had, I guess, an integrity. He wasn't going to sell out. And even if he made a subpar film compared to some of his greater works, he was going to do it his own way. And Gordon Green is someone who probably had that talent, and you see some of the later stuff that he did that is, at this barely above Porky's level, and it's kind of disturbing. And I think that's one of the things that, for especially a young filmmaker, someone like Edwin, or anyone who might be listening, that's one of the things that stands out about Cassavetes. Not only was he a great talent, not only did he have a great talent, but he also had that great integrity. And anyway, so I want to thank both Edwin Nieves and Alex Sheremet for giving their voices about this. As I said, this apparently was not a day when a lot was going to go right. One of our guests had to drop out because of an emergency, and my recording device for the video didn't work. But I think just listening to what Edwin and Alex said will give a lot of people an idea of what Cassavetes made, who he was, and to go out and seek these films. So I want to thank both Edwin.
Just one more comment about young filmmakers and so on. Cassavetes' approach was absolutely the right one. He knew he wasn't going to be a commercial filmmaker. He knew that he wasn't going to be popular, but he also knew that at least much of what he was doing was exactly what needed to be done, in the sense that he may be ignored in his lifetime, but in the end, the attention will come, the adulation will come. He wasn't around to enjoy it, but, you have to just fucking forget about the bullshit. You have to forget about, getting the pats on the back. You have to forget about the reviews. You have to focus on making good work, because this is the only thing that's going to matter. Everything else is immaterial. Cassavetes, he put his own mortgage on the line. He used his own money. He used millions and millions of his own money. He was always kind of on this precipice of just gambling his life away. And, he did it in a very kind of high stakes way. And, most people, they don't have to go through that. So I can, on a personal level, cannot respect anybody that would sell out for those reasons, because they don't have to have those kinds of high stakes or those high gambles. So they should not be so worried about, a review or some, bullshit that somebody might have told them. If you're doing great work, you just need to continue doing great work. Everything else is just a tangent.
Yeah. And,
said.
yeah. It's let me just end up saying that next week I will have a discussion on the life and career of the writer Herman Melville, and it was just interesting because as Alex was speaking and talking about that, I just saw that my recording device had shown it came up with the two remote webcams, and so I think my problem might have been solved, and then it just went blank. So when Alex was talking about John Cassavetes, it was almost as if his spirit came for a second and fixed it, and then when he stopped talking, it stopped. So, but hopefully by next week, I'll have it figured out, or whatever my issue was with my recorder, I'll have to contact the company. But please watch or listen to this interview, watch the clips, seek out the films of Cassavetes, and come back next week and listen to what some of the people will talk about Herman Melville, because art is important, great art is important, and I want to thank my guests again. So thank you, and I'll be seeing you soon.
The common criticism of John was that the films were not structured, that they seemed loose, that they seemed repetitive, that they seemed to ramble, and that they had great things in them, but that they seemed excessive in terms of length and the duration of certain scenes, and the lack of a plot line.
You get out of here!
I felt that there was some merit to that criticism when I saw something like Husbands.
Listen to this, you're going to hear something beautiful. And you listen too, and you'll find out what life's about, sweetheart. Go ahead.
Dressed in khaki suits, gee, we looked swell. We hummed that Yankee Doodly-Dum. And 500,000 boobs went slugging through hell, and I was a kid with a drum. Oh, say, don't you remember? They called me Al. Then it was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember? I'm your pal.
But when I saw it again, 10 or 12 years later,
Can you spare a dime?
turns out I was wrong. I had grown up to understand the picture.